Peace and blessings to you all. This is a new day for you, and I am Dr. Raul Richardson, and you already know, so very thrilled, excited, and quite delighted to be with you today, this Saturday morning, because we have a very special guest in the house today, my dear friend and brother. A legend in my mind. He's not going to be so inclined to address it in a similar fashion, but he is representative of so much of what's important, not just in a historical perspective, but in a right now, what's happening perspective. My dear friend and brother, Reverend Tonny Algood. Tonny, how you doing, man?
Hey, we're doing great.
Absolutamente. And folks, we're doing great because today, this Saturday morning, we are headed up to Selma, Alabama to celebrate the Edmund Pettus Bridge crossing with a bunch of other people. So, Tony, for those of these folks that are listening, our loyal listeners to A New Day for You on Inspire You on Air, the New Beat of the Bay, tell them, just give them a little sampling of, where we're going, why it's important, and what they might be missing that we're going to get a chance to experience greatly today.
This is the 58th anniversary of the crossing of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and it was known as Bloody Sunday because that's when the police, the highway patrol, and those on horses beat people as they came across the bridge heading to Montgomery. Mm-hmm. And it was soon that had a big impact on the passage of the Voting Rights Act, too.
Yeah, and I tell you, it's remarkable that the Voting Rights Act remains unpassed in the current version of Congress right now. So let's talk about some of I'm glad you brought that up because the events that precipitated the Bloody Sunday March across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, let's state for those that may be uninitiated what was kind of like, the once upon a time moment in this story in terms of the political climate and what some other factors and circumstances were going on that caused people to want to do this, what we now see as a historic and momentous event.
As we know, at that time, the South was under Jim Crow, and that's what folks were really fighting and fighting for the right to vote too. The South had for a long time been under, I guess the best way you could put it is that it was a terrorist government at that time. The police, the highway patrol, the council of the White Citizens Council, they were all playing a role in doing everything that they could to keep blacks from achieving the equality and the rights that every other citizen had.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes. And their activism was in the form of terrorism. I think you can't characterize it any differently in terms of the Jim Crow laws, some of the segregation ideology, the lynching, the burnings, the Ku Klux Klan. And, for those of our loyal listeners that don't necessarily know, why it is that I selected you to be my guest today for this particular significant moment in our history, tell them a little bit about your experiences even prior to this event.
Well, I grew up in Mississippi during the time of Jim Crow. I got involved in the civil rights movement when I was 18 and the anti-war movement about the same time. I planned on going on to seminary, but the churches then were segregated and supporting segregation. They were very much opposed to integration. So I did not go into seminary. I organized poor black and white woodcutters and poultry workers in Mississippi, worked with the Charles Evers campaign. John Lewis and Julian Bond, we set up voter registration tours in North Mississippi and South Mississippi Farm. I got involved when I moved to Mobile in the labor movement and fighting discrimination in the workplace. Uh, I've really had quite a lot of experiences that have been very good that I was blessed to have. Uh, Today, I'm the tri-chair for the Alabama Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. Dr. King, in December of 1967, said it's time to move from uh, voting rights and civil rights to human rights. And he started organizing poor Black, white, and Latino uh, people. And he was being very successful at it. He brought together the young lords and the young patriots and the Panthers and others from Appalachia and from the poverty-stricken Mississippi Delta into the campaign. And that is really why he was assassinated. And we've picked up the baton, you might say, that was
Yes.
dropped at his death and revived the Poor People's Campaign 50 years later.
Wow. That's
And
remarkable.
we are fighting the same fight that he did then: systemic racism, systemic poverty, uh, environmental devastation, the bloated military budget, the war economy, and Christian nationalism.
Hmm. Hmm. Wow. And I think it's important to reiterate what you just said, that 58 years, you said it's been since the crossing of the bridge?
Yes, this
And
is the
it's
58th anniversary.
58 years later, and these issues that Dr. King picked up are still relevant and active today. So much so, in fact, that I just think it's remarkable that Dr. Reverend Barber decided to, you know, reproduce it and get people moving in that direction and bring all those diverse groups together to speak with hopefully one voice, uh,
Mm-hmm.
truth to power.
Most certainly. And this evening there will be a mass meeting in Selma at 5:30 where Dr. Barber will be speaking. And we are encouraging everybody that can to come out to it.
Mm. So let's talk a little bit about what today looks like, because I am so excited to get on the bus and go up to Selma, Alabama, because a year ago, this time last year, my intention was to travel with you to Selma. And unfortunately, at that time, that was just precipitating the death of my mom. So
Mm.
I was all ready to travel to Selma and be a part of all of those activities. And then suddenly I felt that I couldn't go. So this year represents a lot for me, but just makes me reflect back to that period of time where I was committed to going, and circumstances and a set of events were in motion that prevented me from attending. But this year, I can't wait to get on the bus and get up to Selma. I really can't.
Yeah, yeah, we have a great group of folks going. We have about uh, 30 that'll be going on a bus from Mobile today. And then we have another 12 that will be going up on their own, but will be attending the events.
Mm-hmm. Well, tell our loyal listeners, having been there, having experienced it, having, in maybe not in a real sense, but in a experiential sense, the bloody Sunday crossing 58 years ago, last year. Um, tell us what emotions come to mind, what reflections, what memories, maybe from your boyhood growing up in Mississippi, or things that may have just happened within the last week. I know you're actively involved in dealing with a homeless campaign here locally. I know that you've been involved with inner city missions for many, many years. So kind of, juxtapose, if you would, um, what your emotions were from last year's participation in this event, um, things that you may reflect on from your childhood and your early experiences that you've already shared, and what your thoughts and feelings are as you prepare to get on the bus to go to Selma today?
Um, it's, I'd have to say it's somber. Okay. My mood is really somber today. I look, and I've walked across Edmund Pettus Bridge during several anniversaries, and I can't help think about folks that I have worked with, like the late Congressman John Lewis,
Mm-hmm,
who
mm-hmm.
was severely beaten crossing that bridge, along with others, and then to think about the struggle that we have ahead of us, too, how much that more there is to be done. We have less voting rights today than we did when the Voting Rights Act was passed. That's the way they have eaten away at it. And so all these emotions, the the times working in Mississippi when we were organizing poor black and white poetry workers, and we were on strike, and the beat up by a Klansman while the police stood by and watched. As a matter of fact, they set up to it. So I understand too a certain amount of the fear that people must have had, but they crossing that bridge on Bloody Sunday, but how brave they were to go ahead and do it anyway.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, we've had some tremendous guests here on New Day for You for Black History Month. We started off with Councilman and historian Fred Richardson. We then had on, Dr. Kern Jackson, Director of African American Studies at University of South Alabama. We had on the Honorable Sam Jones, former mayor and now legislative representative for District 99 from the Alabama legislature. We've actually had on Robert Kennedy, our dear friend and brother from the NAACP, as the president on. And now, while Black History Month technically is over, because obviously this is the first Saturday in March, you know, you have some experiences and background, and the language is what always interests me. The language of the times. I ran into a young gentleman just today, and he was complaining about some negative experiences he had at work, and he was talking about racism and things of that sort. And I was trying to make him to understand, the epistemology of words and language, and how over the course of time words seem to mean different things over a period of time. But you, as a young white man growing up in Mississippi, have aligned yourself with these efforts, these struggles. Commissioner Masseria Ludgood shared with me the phrase "La luta continua," the struggle continues, from a very early age. And I got to imagine that that struggle was real for you in some ways, in terms of what other members of your community or your family may have thought about your willingness to participate in what they may have perceived as a struggle that was not necessarily your battle. But if it were not for the efforts of real warriors like yourself, and you mentioned Evers and King, and but there are some names that are going to go unmentioned in the history journals. But perhaps you can share what your thoughts are as it relates to Bloody Sunday, the movement, the Poor People's Campaign, and some of the genesis that kind of precipitated your experiences and movement.
Um, it's something that you mentioned, Masseria Ludgood and Sam Jones. We met each other on a picket line about 1977 out in Crichton in front of Gibson's. And we've stayed close and close friends since then. The it's kind of hard to understand maybe for some people, but Jesus said, "I came not to bring peace, but to bring a sword, to separate
Yes.
mother from daughter and father from son." Well, I now understand what he's talking about in that,
Mm.
because if you fight for justice and you fight to transform a corrupt system that does nothing but create more poverty, you're going to lose friends and family. And I've lost both. And one thing that I found out that the authorities hated worse than the civil rights movement, civil rights workers in Mississippi, was if you were white, because you were considered a traitor. Okay, and it was hard to bear sometimes, but thank goodness I had friends and fellow workers and organizers that encouraged, and so I kept going, and I'm so glad that I did. One of the things too, today there are 2.1 million people in Alabama living in poverty. That's about 45% of the population.
Wow.
974,000 are people of color. 1.1 million are white. Now, to hear the media talk about it, they always look at the poor and poverty as black, but that's just not the case. And we know that when these two groups come together and act in their own interest, then we'll be able to transform this system.
Wow. I'm so glad you shared that data point. I've been over the last couple of months sharing a lot of information, not only about Black History Month, but about Reverend Barber's third Reconstruction and the history of the Reconstruction movement and other significant legislative events that have happened that brought us into this moment in time. And it's interesting how the perspective seems unimpacted by the reality of the statistics and the facts. You know, there are certain elements of the contemporary society that talk about fake news and alternative facts and things of that sort. And then we find ourselves now dealing with things like critical race theory because we don't want to have a conversation about those elements of American history that reflect what actually happened because it makes me uncomfortable. And the reality is, you know, change is going to come. And the question really becomes, are you going to be part of the change or are you going to be, you know, rolled over by the change? And, you know, I can't tell you what it means to me to have you as a friend and brother and knowing your deep rooted faith and how that has probably helped you persevere over all of these circumstances. Folks, listen, if you're just tuning in, you're listening to A New Day for You with me, Dr. Raul Richardson. I'm chatting it up with my dear friend and brother, Reverend Tonny Algood, the tri-chair of the Poor People's Campaign here in Alabama, as we are preparing to get on the bus to go to Selma to reflect, reminisce, support, and be activists engaged in the crossing of the Edmund Pettus Bridge some 58 years later. So, Tonny, I know it. Some people are thinking Bloody Sunday, and why does Doc sound excited and happy and thrilled? Because I want to be there. I want to feel. Clearly, I don't want to feel what Reverend Lewis felt in terms of, you know, nightstick upside my head and dogs and hoses and things of that sort. But I want to keep that thought, that imagery, that understanding alive because the Voting Rights Act is still sitting in Congress right now.
Mm-hmm. Most certainly.
Mm-hmm.
Most certainly.
And I think, you know, folks like yourself should be commended. You know, we use all kinds of words today, like, you know, allies and other kinds of phrasing. But the fact of the matter is, you know, you've had skin in the game. You've put things at risk. You've had relationships, whether it was family and or friends, that were challenged by the fact that you were willing to stand up for that which was representative of righteousness. And to that end, you should be commended. And I'm grateful for all of that. So I can't tell you how much it means to me. I thank you. Listen, folks, what we're going to do is we are going to take a quick break with me and Reverend Tonny Algood, and we're going to come back and we're going to do some more of this. And we're going to share with those of you that are not going to be able to attend the march today to get a sense of our excitement, maybe get some empathetic response about what it means to share this moment in history, what it means to be activists, what it means to be engaged in your community, and what it means for future generations to attempt to recreate the sacrifices made by people like Dr. King and Reverend Lewis and my dear friend and brother, Reverend Tonny Algood. So don't you dare move. We'll be right back.